Hey everyone, welcome back. I'll be honest, this story got me because it's not about some big romantic gesture. So let's get into it.
The knock came a little after midnight, soft enough that I almost blamed the wind and kept working. I was in the back room of my house, hunched over a client's deadbolt at my bench, with brass shavings on my fingers and a half-cold mug of coffee beside a row of tiny screws that would absolutely vanish if I breathed wrong. Midnight was not unusual for me. When you owned a small locksmith and security repair business, your schedule belonged to broken doors, jammed locks, bad X's with spare keys, and people who discovered too late that I'll remember the code was not a real security plan. I lived in a narrow old house in Richmond, Virginia, one of those renovated row homes with brick steps, original floors, and windows that complained every time the weather changed. My neighbor, Rafe Quinn, always said I had the perfect job for my personality because I was quiet, useful, and apparently emotionally compatible with deadbolts. I told him that was the kindest insult I had received all week. The knock came again, this time sharper, and something in my body went still before my mind caught up. People who knocked after midnight usually brought either panic or bad decisions. I wiped my hands on a rag, crossed the hall, and expected to find Rafe on the porch with some emergency involving his back gate, his truck, or his inability to own a working flashlight. Instead, when I opened the door, I found his younger sister standing under the porch light in a raincoat that did not belong over the dress beneath it. Elara Quinn looked like she had walked out of one life and had not yet been admitted into the next. Her dark hair was pinned up badly, half coming loose around her face. Mascara had blurred at the corners of her eyes, not enough to make her look messy, just enough to make her look human in a way I had no defense for. In one hand, she held a broken heel by the strap. In the other, she held herself together. For a second, neither of us said anything. That was dangerous, because silence made room for all the things I had spent nearly a year not saying. I knew Elara through Rafe, which meant I knew her at cookouts, from across driveways, beside flower buckets in the back of her van, smiling politely while carrying arrangements into someone else's celebration. She was an event florist, the kind of woman who could turn a bare folding table into something people photographed. But every time I saw her with flowers in her arms, I noticed the tiredness under her grace. I had fixed Rafe's side door once while Elara sat on the porch steps unwrapping eucalyptus stems, and she had asked me if all locks were just stubborn little puzzles. I told her most locks were honest if you listened. She laughed and said that sounded like something a man would say right before avoiding a personal question. I had liked her immediately and punished myself for it by becoming aggressively respectful. Now she stood on my porch after midnight, rain glittering on her sleeves, lips parted like she had rehearsed 3 different explanations and lost all of them on the way over. I said her name, because apparently that was all the intelligence I had available. She looked past my shoulder into the warm light of my hallway, then back at me, and said quietly, I didn't know where else to go. The words were simple, but they did something complicated to my chest. They did not sound romantic. They sounded exhausted. They sounded like a woman who had been told too many places were hers until she actually needed one. My first instinct was practical. Check for danger, check for injury, check whether someone had followed her. That instinct saved me from the other one, which was to step closer than I had any right to step. I asked if she was hurt. She shook her head too quickly, then corrected herself and said, not like that. I looked over her shoulder toward the wet street. No cars idled there. No one stood under the trees. Rafe's house next door was dark except for the porch bulb he always forgot to turn off. I asked if Briar had done something, and the name changed her face before she could hide it. Briar Vale was the kind of man people described as impressive when they did not have to live with him. I had met him twice, both times at Rafe's, both times wearing the expression of a man who believed rooms improved when he entered them. Elara's engagement to him had broken off months ago, officially, though Richmond social circles had a way of treating broken engagements like misplaced jewelry that would be found and returned once everyone calmed down. Elara tightened her grip on the broken shoe and said she was not in danger. Then, after a breath, she added that she was just done pretending she was fine. That was the line that made me open the door wider. Not because I understood everything, but because I understood doors. Some were meant to stay closed. Some were meant to protect what was inside. And some became cruel when a person was standing outside them with nowhere honest left to stand. I stepped back and told her to come in. She hesitated only for a second, and that hesitation reminded me exactly who she was: Rafe's sister. Not some stranger from a lockout call, not a client, not a woman I could let myself want just because she had come to me shaking in the rain. Still, she crossed the threshold. Inside, the hallway seemed too narrow for the amount of awareness that followed her in. She smelled faintly like rain, roses, and some expensive perfume worn down by a long night. I took her coat only after she loosened the belt herself, careful not to touch more than fabric. Under it, her dress was deep green satin, formal enough for an engagement party or a room full of people pretending not to stare. One strap sat slightly twisted on her shoulder, and I looked away so fast I probably made it obvious I had noticed. She gave a small, broken laugh and said I did not have to act like she was a live wire. I told her live wires were usually easier because at least they came with rules. That got the corner of her mouth to move, and for 1 second I saw the Elara from Rafe's cookouts, the woman with quick eyes and quiet jokes. Then she looked down at the snapped heel in her hand and the smile disappeared. I led her to the kitchen because kitchens made emergencies feel less official. My house was not built for midnight visits from women I had no business wanting. There was a half-disassembled lock on my workbench, a stack of invoices near the toaster, and a dish towel hanging from the oven handle that said, "Secure your doors and your feelings," a joke gift from Rafe that had unfortunately become accurate. Elara sat at the small table like she was afraid to take up too much room. I put water on for tea, then placed a towel beside her without making a ceremony of it. She thanked me softly. I told her she did not have to explain yet. She looked at me then, really looked, and said that was why she came, because everyone else wanted an explanation before they decided whether she was allowed to fall apart. I should have called Rafe. A decent man would at least think about it, and I did. He was my neighbor, my friend in the casual male way of borrowed tools and porch beers, and this was his sister sitting barefoot in my kitchen after midnight. But when Elara wrapped both hands around the mug I gave her and asked if she could stay until morning, just until morning, the answer rose in me before the caution did. I said yes. Then I stood there with her broken heel on my table, her raincoat over my chair, and her eyes trying not to beg for softness, realizing the hardest door I had to manage that night was not the one I had opened. It was the one inside me, between being decent and wanting her. Elara sat in my kitchen wearing a formal dress under a sweatshirt that had my company logo across the chest, and I had to concentrate very hard on the tea kettle like it was a complicated piece of machinery. The sweatshirt was old, dark gray, and too big on her in a way that made the whole situation feel more intimate than it should have. Voss lock and entry stretched crookedly across her front because she had pulled it on over the satin dress without bothering to smooth anything. Her bare feet were tucked under the chair, her broken heel lay on the table between us, and the rain kept ticking against the kitchen window like it wanted credit for the mood. I set a mug of tea near her hand and told myself this was simple. A woman I knew had shown up upset. I had given her something warm and dry. There was nothing dangerous about that unless a man had been lying to himself for months. She thanked me, but her voice had that thin edge people get when they are trying not to fall apart because politeness is the last structure still standing. I found a pair of clean socks in the laundry basket by the back hall and set them on the table without comment. Elara looked at them, then at me, and asked if this was standard locksmith service. I told her only for premium clients and women who arrived with dramatic footwear. That earned a small smile, which felt like winning something I had no right to compete for. She reached for the socks, then hesitated because her hands were still shaking. I looked away toward the stove, pretending to adjust the burner under water that had already boiled, because some kinds of dignity require witnesses to become temporarily blind. The broken heel gave my hand something useful to do, and I was grateful for it. I pulled my small toolkit from the hallway drawer, the one I kept for cabinet hinges, loose screws, and the dozens of tiny domestic failures people never noticed until they ruined a day. Elara pushed the shoe toward me and said she had snapped the strap 3 blocks from here, which explained the small red marks near her ankle and the fact that she had walked in the rain like a woman too stubborn to call for help. I asked why she did not call Rafe. She wrapped both hands around the mug and looked down into the steam. For a moment, I thought she would not answer. Then she said Rafe would have arrived angry, asked who had done what, and turned her pain into a family emergency before she had figured out what she felt. I understood that more than I wanted to. Protective people could still make a room smaller if they needed to be the loudest thing in it. I kept my eyes on the shoe while she talked, though every few seconds I was aware of her knee near the edge of the table, the hem of the dress beneath the sweatshirt, the loose strand of hair stuck damply against her neck. Desire, I had learned, was rarely convenient enough to wait for appropriate lighting and clean circumstances. It arrived in kitchens after midnight while a woman you should not want sat across from you trying not to cry into tea. Elara told me the event had been at the Jefferson Hotel, some formal donor dinner tied to Breyer's family business, though everyone had treated it like a soft launch for reconciliation. Her parents were there. Rafe had skipped it because he hated Breyer with the honest simplicity of an older brother, but Elara had gone because she was tired of being called dramatic for staying away. She said the room had been full of people who smiled at her like they were waiting for her to recover from herself. Breyer had made a speech. That was the part she said with a laugh that was not remotely amused. He stood up near dessert, thanked everyone for supporting the foundation, then looked right at her while talking about patience, forgiveness, and how sometimes people wandered from the life meant for them before finding their way back. He never said her name. He did not have to. Everyone looked at her anyway, kindly, horribly, like she was the lost object in a story he had already decided ended with her returning. Elara said she sat there in that green dress, smiling so hard her face hurt, while her mother squeezed her hand under the table like a warning, and Breyer's friends lifted their glasses as if love was just reputation with flowers on it. When the applause started, she stood up, walked out through the side hall, and kept walking until one heel broke and the rain made it impossible to pretend she was still composed. I tightened the tiny screw through the strap, buying time because anger had moved through me fast and clean. Breyer's kind of control was hard to prove because it wore good manners. A man like that did not block a door. He convinced everyone the door had always been open and you were rude for not walking through it. I told Elara I was sorry, and she looked up at me, maybe expecting advice, outrage, or the usual question people asked when they wanted to know why she had not handled humiliation more elegantly. I gave her none of that. I only said no one had the right to make her life sound like a phase she would outgrow. Her eyes changed then, not dramatically, but enough. The room softened around the sentence. When I finished the shoe, I set it carefully beside her mug. The repair was not perfect, but it would hold until morning. Elara touched the strap with one finger and said I was very good at fixing exits. I told her exits were usually easier than entrances. She looked at me then, and the quiet between us became too aware of itself. I should have stood. I should have called Rafe, made up the couch, created distance with some practical action. Instead, I stayed seated with my hands on the table and listened as she admitted that she had not walked to Rafe's apartment because she did not want to be protected before she was heard. Then she said my porch light had been closer, but that was not the real reason. The real reason was that I never looked at her like she needed to be managed. That landed somewhere I had kept locked for years. My ex-fiancé had once told me I made life feel too safe, and she had not meant it kindly. Too predictable, too steady, too ready with the spare key in the emergency plan. I had taken that sentence and built a whole private shame around it, treating reliability like a defect people tolerated until someone more exciting came along. But Elara sat in my kitchen, wrapped in my sweatshirt, saying the very thing I had been rejected for was the reason she had knocked. I reached for the tea mug just to have something to do. Then I said Rafe should know she was safe. The words were responsible. They were also a retreat, and we both heard it. Elara's face closed a little, not with anger, but with exhaustion. She nodded and said she would text him in a minute. Then she looked straight at me and asked if she could be safe with me for one night before becoming everyone else's problem. I had no defense against that. The repaired heel sat between us. The rain blurred the dark window, and every decent reason to keep distance was still true. But so was this. She had chosen my door when every other door in her life felt like a performance. I told her yes, she could stay. And the relief that crossed her face made me understand that sometimes opening a door was the easiest part. Letting someone believe they were welcome was much harder. Elara texted Rafe from my kitchen table with both thumbs hovering over the screen like the message might bite her. I watched without meaning to, then made myself look away because a man who repaired locks for a living should have known better than to stare at someone else's private door. She typed, deleted, typed again, and finally sent something short enough that I could see the relief and guilt cross her face at the same time. I told him, "I'm safe," she said. I asked if she told him where, and she gave me a look over the rim of her mug. Not defensive exactly, just tired. She said no, not yet, because if Rafe knew she was in my kitchen after midnight wearing my sweatshirt, he would arrive with questions, assumptions, and probably a tire iron he would insist was only for emotional support. I almost smiled, because that sounded like Rafe, but the part of me with a conscience stayed awake. Secrets had weight, even well-meant ones. Especially well-meant ones. Elara noticed my silence. Of course she did. Women like her did not survive polished rooms and smiling pressure by missing discomfort. She set her mug down and asked if I was always this careful. I said careful was cheaper than regret. She leaned back in the chair, the oversized sweatshirt slipping off one shoulder just enough that I had to become deeply interested in the crack in my kitchen tile. She said careful sounded like something people praised when they wanted obedience and criticized when they wanted excitement. That hit closer than she knew, and because I was tired, because it was late, because she had knocked on my door with rain in her hair and trust in her hands, I answered more honestly than I planned. I told her careful was what people liked about me, right up until they decided it was boring. My ex-fiance's name was Liana, and I had not said her name out loud in months. Elara did not ask, but the story found the open space between us anyway. I told her Liana used to say I made her feel safe, back when safety meant I picked her up from the airport, kept a spare charger in my truck, remembered which restaurant had the corner booth she liked, and checked the locks twice because she watched too many crime documentaries. Later, when she left, safe became the word she used, like a towel thrown over furniture she no longer wanted. Too safe, too predictable, too steady. She said she wanted a life that surprised her, and apparently I had become the emergency contact version of a man. I tried to say that last part like a joke, but Elara did not laugh. She looked angry for me, which was somehow more intimate than pity. She said safety was only boring to people who had never needed it for real. The sentence was quiet, but it landed with the force of a door closing against wind. I looked at her then. Really looked. She was still pale from the night, still damp at the edges, still wrapped in a sweatshirt that made her seem both protected and too close. But her eyes had cleared. She was not just the woman who had run from Breyer's speech and Richmond's expectations. She was the woman sitting in my kitchen telling me that the thing I had been ashamed of was not a defect. I asked if that was why she came to me, because I was safe. The question came out rougher than I wanted. I hated that I needed the answer. I hated more that I cared which way it went. Elara did not rush. She looked down at her repaired heel, then toward the hallway where my workbench light was still glowing faintly from the back room. She said she did not knock because I was convenient. Rafe's apartment was farther, yes, but she had a phone and enough stubbornness to call a car if all she needed was transportation. She came because every time she had seen me, I had opened space without filling it. At cookouts, I did not interrupt women when they spoke. When her aunt asked too many questions about Breyer, I changed the subject without making it obvious. When Rafe's gate stuck during that storm, I fixed it and left before anyone could turn gratitude into debt. She said I never made her feel managed. Then her voice softened in a way that made me grip the table edge. I came because I knew you would open the door and still let me decide how far inside I wanted to come. I had no idea what to do with that. My hands knew pins, tumblers, hinges, strike plates, the mechanical honesty of pressure applied in the right place. My heart unfortunately had no such diagram. I told her she was giving me too much credit. She said maybe I was giving myself too little. I tried to deflect, because habit is faster than courage, and said Rafe would be thrilled to hear his sister had chosen my door based on my excellent ability to not interrupt women. Elara smiled, but it was sad around the edges. She said Rafe loved her, but sometimes he protected her like she was a vase that had already cracked. Breyer displayed her like she was a vase he had bought. I was the first man in a long time who had simply handed her a towel and waited for her to say what she needed. That should not have felt like desire. It did. The night stretched thin after that. I made up the couch with a spare blanket and a pillow that had seen better years. Elara stood beside it, holding the repaired heel in one hand, suddenly awkward now that the talking had slowed. I told her she could take my room, and she said if I offered that again, she would assume I had a martyr complex and diagnose me without a license. I told her locksmiths did not have martyr complexes, only excellent boundary issues. She laughed softly, and the sound eased something between us. Before I went to the hallway, she said my name. When I turned back, she looked smaller in the dim light, swallowed by my sweatshirt, one hand on the folded blanket. She thanked me for not making the night worse by trying to be impressive. I told her not being impressive was one of my core skills. Her smile stayed with me longer than it should have. I did not sleep much. I sat in the back room for a while, pretending to organize screws while listening to the old house settle around her presence. Every decent instinct told me to keep distance. Every honest instinct told me distance had become another kind of lie. Around 3, the rain stopped. Around 4, I finally dozed in the chair by my workbench. When I woke, gray morning light had reached the floorboards, and the house was quiet in a way that felt changed. Elara was asleep on the couch, one hand tucked under her cheek, my sweatshirt sleeve pulled over her fingers. She looked peaceful for the first time since I had opened the door. I stood there for maybe 2 seconds too long, then my phone buzzed on the workbench. Rafe's name lit the screen, followed by one message that made my stomach drop. Have you seen my sister? Rafe's message sat on my phone like a small explosive. Have you seen my sister? 5 words, no punctuation, which told me more than punctuation would have. Rafe was awake, worried, and already halfway to imagining the worst. I stood in the back room with the phone in my hand and looked toward the living room, where Elara was still asleep on my couch in my sweatshirt, one bare foot tucked under the blanket, the repaired heel on the coffee table like evidence. There was no version of this that looked simple from the outside. His sister had disappeared after a public event involving her ex-fiancé, texted that she was safe, but not where she was, and spent the night in the house of the man who lived next door to him. I was 37 years old, fully aware of how doors worked, and still somehow trapped between 3 of them. I did not answer right away, which was the first mistake. The second mistake was trying to make coffee quietly in a kitchen where every cabinet hinge had apparently signed a contract with betrayal. Elara stirred when the kettle clicked on. She opened her eyes slowly, then seemed to remember where she was all at once. I saw it happen. The couch, the blanket, the sweatshirt, me standing in the kitchen with my phone in my hand and the expression of a man being audited by his conscience. She sat up and pushed her hair back, suddenly embarrassed in a way she had not been at midnight. Morning did that. Night made vulnerability feel protected. Morning put shoes on it and asked for an explanation. I told her Rafe had texted. Her face tightened, but she nodded like she had expected the bill to arrive. We made breakfast because neither of us was brave enough to begin with the main thing. Toast, coffee, and the last 2 eggs in my refrigerator, which had survived my bachelor meal planning by luck and low expectations. Elara stood near the counter, still in my sweatshirt, the green dress hidden beneath it, the repaired heel now set neatly beside her broken one. I told her she could keep the socks, and she said that was very generous considering they had my company logo on them and therefore counted as advertising. It should have been awkward. It was awkward, but there was also a strange ease in it, the kind that made danger look ordinary. She buttered toast like she had done it in my kitchen before. I poured coffee into the mug she had used last night without asking. Both of us noticed. Neither of us said anything. Finally, I told her I needed to answer him. Elara leaned against the counter, holding the mug in both hands. She said she knew. I asked what she wanted me to say, and she gave me a look that stopped me before I could hide behind courtesy. She said not to make her sound like a package I had accidentally signed for. The words hit harder than they should have, because they were fair. I had already been thinking in careful phrases. She came here upset. I let her sleep. Nothing happened. All true. All incomplete. Those sentences protected me. They protected Rafe. They did not fully protect her, because they made her choice sound like something that happened around her instead of something she made. I told her that. She looked surprised, then softer, and said she was tired of men explaining her life in ways that made themselves comfortable. I typed Rafe back before I could overthink it. I told him Elara was safe, that she had come to my place after the event, and that she could explain the rest herself when she was ready. The reply came almost immediately. "I'm coming over." Elara closed her eyes. I said I could tell him not to, and she said that would only make him arrive faster and louder. She went to change back into her dress, then returned with the sweatshirt folded over one arm and the raincoat belted tightly at her waist, like fabric could restore the version of herself her family expected. I hated that I noticed. I hated more that I understood. There was a difference between being ready to leave and preparing to be collected. Rafe knocked hard enough to make the door frame take him personally. When I opened it, he stood on the porch in a gray hoodie, hair damp from the morning mist, eyes moving past me before he asked permission. He saw Elara in the hallway, saw the folded sweatshirt, saw the repaired heel in her hand, and his face went through worry, relief, anger, and brotherly suspicion so fast I almost respected the efficiency. He said her name first, then mine, and somehow mine sounded more like an accusation. Elara stepped forward before I could speak. She told him she was okay. Rafe asked why she was at my house. His voice was controlled, but barely. I told him she knocked after midnight, upset and soaked, and I gave her a safe place to sleep. That was all I said because the rest was not mine. Rafe looked at me like he was deciding whether to believe the shape of my face. He said she was vulnerable, and I felt the accusation under it. Not loud, not unfair, exactly. Just protective enough to wound, I told him I knew. Elara's head turned toward me, and I could feel how carefully she was listening. Rafe said vulnerable women did not always make clear decisions, especially after men like Briar. That was when Elara's expression changed. She stepped fully between us, not to defend me like I needed saving, but because she was done being discussed as if she had left the room. She told Rafe she had chosen my door, not because she was helpless, not because I had asked her to, because she trusted me, and because last night she needed one place where nobody turned her pain into a committee meeting. The hallway went quiet. Rafe looked at his sister then, really looked, and some of the anger drained into fear. He said he had been scared. Elara's face softened, and she told him she knew. But she also said love did not give him the right to handle her like something cracked. Rafe swallowed that one like it had edges. I stood by the open door with my hands at my sides, aware that saying too much would make me the kind of man I was trying not to be. After a long moment, Rafe nodded once and asked if she wanted to come with him. Elara looked at me, then back at her brother. She said yes, but the pause before it told the truth neither of us was ready to name. After they left, the house felt too quiet in a way it had not before she knocked. I cleaned the mugs, folded the blanket, and returned the toolkit to the drawer. Then I saw the repaired heel still sitting on my kitchen table. Under it was a small piece of receipt paper, folded once. I opened it and recognized Elara's handwriting immediately. Neat, but hurried. I wasn't done being here. The note stayed on my kitchen table longer than it should have. I told myself I left it there because I did not know where to put it, which was technically true if a man defined where as any physical location that did not make him feel things. I had jobs that day, real ones, the kind with invoices and problem descriptions and doors that did not care about my private confusion. A woman in Church Hill had a front lock that stuck every time it rained. A property manager needed 3 deadbolts rekeyed after a tenant moved out, angry enough to keep copies. An older couple called because their smart lock had decided technology was a mistake and trapped them on their own porch until I arrived with tools and a face that suggested this happened more often than the brochure admitted. All day, I opened doors for people, gave them back access to spaces they already owned, and tried not to think about the woman who had left a repaired heel behind like a question. That was the problem with my work. It gave a man too many metaphors if he was already in danger of becoming dramatic. Every lock had a reason it failed. Dirt in the pins, bad alignment, warped wood, a cheap strike plate pretending to be stronger than it was. People were less honest. They could spend years insisting nothing was wrong while forcing the same key into the same stuck place and calling the damage patience. By 4 o'clock, I was sitting in my truck outside an apartment building, eating a granola bar that tasted like compressed regret, staring at Elara's note folded in my cup holder. I had taken it with me because apparently I was now the kind of man who transported emotional evidence between service calls. I kept hearing her voice from my hallway, telling Rafe she had chosen my door, not drifted there, not collapsed there, chosen. The word had become a small, dangerous machine inside me. Across town, Elara was back in the florist studio pretending she had not spent the night in a locksmith's sweatshirt. I found that out later from Juniper Sloan, though everyone called her June, who had the bright-eyed cruelty of a best friend with access to floral scissors and the truth. Elara worked out of a converted warehouse space near Scott's Addition, surrounded by buckets of roses, ranunculus, eucalyptus, and whatever flowers wealthy brides were currently pretending had deep symbolic meaning. June saw the sweatshirt immediately under Elara's coat because June noticed everything that could become a conversation. She asked whether Voslok and Entry had started a clothing line for emotionally compromised women. Elara told her she was working and would appreciate silence, which June apparently took as permission to become louder. June knew about Briar, of course. She knew about the donor dinner, the speech, the broken heel, and enough of the family pressure to dislike everyone on Elara's behalf. But when Elara told her where she had gone, June did not immediately turn it into a romance. That was why Elara trusted her. June only grew quiet, trimmed the thorns off a stem, and asked if I was safe or if I was convenient. Elara said I was safe. June said that was not what she had asked. According to Elara, that was when she nearly stabbed a floral foam block with unnecessary force. June warned her not to turn me into a room she ran to only when Briar made the world unbearable. Safe rooms mattered, she said, but they were not the same as love unless you also wanted to stay there when nobody was chasing you. Elara told her she had thought about me before Briar's speech, before the rain, before the heel broke, before she needed somewhere to go. She said my name had been in her head for months. Quietly, inconveniently, like a porch light she was not supposed to look toward. I did not know any of that when she came to my workshop that evening. I only knew I had returned home, found the repaired heel on the table again after carrying it there from the kitchen like an idiot, and decided not to call her because calling Rafe's sister felt like crossing a line I had painted myself. My workshop sat at the back of the house, half garage, half evidence that I owned too many tiny drawers. The air smelled like metal filings, oil, and cedar from an old door I was restoring for a client who wanted historic charm but also expected it to close properly, which was a contradiction I respected. I had the heel on the bench beside a row of lock cylinders when I heard the front bell. For one ridiculous second, I thought it might be Rafe coming to hit me with a tire iron after all. Instead, Elara stood on my porch in jeans, a cream sweater, and boots, her hair loose around her shoulders and her expression too steady to be casual. She said she came for her shoe. I looked down at her feet and said both of them appeared functional. She did not smile as much as I hoped. I stepped aside and let her in, because apparently that was what we did now. Doors opening, both of us pretending not to understand the pattern. In the workshop, she moved slowly, looking at the locks, the keys hanging from hooks, the half-repaired door balanced on sawhorses. She touched nothing, but her eyes took in everything. I handed her the heel, and she turned it over in her hands like the repair meant more than it should. Then she looked at me and asked if I had spent the whole day deciding how to make last night smaller. The question was so accurate I almost resented her for not giving me warning. I told her I was trying to be careful. Elara set the heel back on the bench between us, and the soft click of it against the wood sounded final. She asked if careful meant Rafe, Briar, or me. I said all of the above, which was true and useless. Her eyes did not leave mine. She said Rafe was her brother, not her owner. Briar was her past, not her translator. And I, Callum Voss, was not allowed to decide that being safe meant I could not also be wanted. I tried to answer with humor because humor had gotten me through many uncomfortable thresholds, but she stepped closer before the joke could form. Not close enough to force anything. Close enough to make distance feel chosen instead of accidental. She said she did not come back for the shoe. Then she looked toward the door, back at me, and asked if I wanted her to leave. I wanted to say no. That was the honest answer, and because it was honest, it got stuck somewhere behind my teeth. Elara stood in my workshop with one hand resting near the repaired heel, her cream sweater soft under the overhead light, her eyes steady in a way that made every lock in the room feel unnecessary. I had spent years being good at doors. Open them, close them, repair them, reinforce them, make sure the wrong people stayed out and the right people could get back in. But a woman asking whether I wanted her to leave was not a door. It was a mirror. If I said yes, I would be lying to protect the version of myself that made clean choices and slept alone without complications. If I said no, I would be admitting that Elara Quinn had not become dangerous when she knocked after midnight. She had been dangerous for months. Every time she smiled at me from Rafe's porch with flowers in her arms and made safe feel less like an insult. I told her I did not want her to leave. The words came out quiet, but they did not wobble. Alara's face changed just slightly, like she had prepared herself for dignity and been surprised by relief. She looked down at the heel, then back at me, and said she had noticed me long before the night at the Jefferson. I tried to make a joke about being hard to miss when I was usually carrying someone's broken lock or pretending Rafe's gate was not personally attacking me, but she shook her head. Not sharply, gently, like she was stopping me from running into an old hiding place. She said she noticed how I checked Mrs. Henley's back door after the storm without making her feel helpless, how I stood at cookouts and listened more than I spoke, how I never reached for a woman's elbow to guide her through a room like she was furniture being moved. She said that when Briar spoke, he filled all the space. When I spoke, I left enough room for someone else to stay herself. That sentence did something to me. I turned away under the excuse of putting a screwdriver back in its drawer because there are moments when a man needs the dignity of a tiny task. Elara let me have it for about 5 seconds. Then she said she knew I thought of myself as safe in the worst way, as if steadiness was what women settled for when the men they really wanted failed them. I hated how exactly she had found the old bruise. I told her women like her did not usually choose men like me. They trusted men like me to change locks after the men like Briar made them afraid. They smiled at men like me across driveways, thanked us for showing up on time, then went back to rooms full of polished people who knew how to make life look expensive. Elara's eyes sharpened, and for the first time that night she looked almost angry. She said Briar was admired in rooms, yes, but admiration had started to feel like glass, clear, cold, and easy to cut yourself on. She stepped closer then. Not fast, not dramatic, just one step that made the workshop seem smaller. She told me Briar knew how to be impressive when everyone was watching, but I was the man she thought of when she needed a door to open without being judged. I looked at her hands, the fingers that arranged flowers for other people's vows, the small scratch near her wrist from some stem or wire, and I realized I had been doing the same thing Briar had done in a quieter costume. He had decided what her return should mean. I had been deciding what her wanting me could not mean. I told her that, and it surprised us both. Elara's expression softened, but she did not let me escape the truth just because I had named it. She said respecting her did not mean turning her into a woman too fragile to know what she wanted. The silence after that had weight, the good kind and the frightening kind. I could hear the old house settling, a car passing outside, the faint metallic tick of the lamp above my bench. Elara was close enough now that I could smell rain still faintly caught in her hair from the night before, under the clean green scent of stems and leaves from the florist's studio. I wanted to touch her, not because she was vulnerable, not because she had come to me upset, because she was standing in my workshop in full daylight, telling me she had seen the parts of me I had been trained to apologize for, and somehow she wanted those parts closer. I said her name, and it came out like a warning. She smiled a little and asked who the warning was for. I told her probably both of us. She reached toward the repaired heel and placed it in my hand, closing my fingers around it for a second before letting go. She said I had fixed what broke, but she was not asking me to fix her. She was asking whether I could believe her when she said she came back because she wanted to. I looked at the shoe, then set it down carefully on the bench. My hand was shaking slightly, which offended me, but Elara noticed and did not smile. She only lifted her hand and touched 2 fingers to my wrist, steadying me in the smallest possible way. That touch should not have been enough to change the temperature of the room. It did anyway. I turned my hand under hers, and our fingers met, not fully held at first, just testing whether the choice could exist without either of us pretending it was accidental. I admitted I had wanted her to. The words felt less like confession than surrender. I said I had wanted her at Rafe's cookouts when she laughed at the wrong parts of my jokes, wanted her when she brought leftover flowers to Mrs. Henley after her cat died, wanted her when she looked at me like safe was not something she needed to survive me. I told her I kept telling myself she was off limits because she was Rafe's sister, because Briar was still in the air around her, because my life worked better when desire had clear labels and emergency exits. Elara's fingers tightened around mine. She said she understood the boundary, but she was tired of being treated like every feeling she had belonged first to her brother, her ex, or someone else's idea of timing. I moved closer before I had planned to. Her eyes dropped to my mouth, then lifted back to mine, and the entire room narrowed to that small, devastating movement. I could have kissed her. She would have let me. Maybe she would have kissed me back. For one reckless second, every decent argument against it felt thin and cowardly. Then I remembered her on my porch, soaked and shaking, saying she did not know where else to go. I remembered Briar turning her pain into a public story. I remembered Rafe's face in my doorway. I stopped with barely an inch between us, my hand still holding hers, my breathing no longer as calm as I wanted it to be. Elara looked at me, hurt already beginning before I spoke. I told her I wanted our first kiss to be something she chose while standing still, not something that happened while she was still proving she had the right to run. Her eyes closed for half a second. When she opened them, the hurt was there, but so was understanding, and that made it worse. She stepped back slowly, taking her hand from mine. She said maybe one day I would learn the difference between respecting her and deciding for her. Then she picked up the repaired heel, held it against her chest like evidence of a night neither of us knew how to finish, and walked toward the front door. I let her go because stopping her would have turned my restraint into another kind of control. But when the door closed behind her, the workshop felt colder than it had before she came back. The next day, I tried to convince myself that letting Elara walk out had been the mature thing. That was how I knew I was in trouble, because whenever a man starts congratulating himself for maturity, he is usually just decorating fear with better furniture. I went through 3 lockout calls, replaced a warped strike plate at a rental property, and rekeyed a back door for a woman who kept apologizing for needing help, until I finally told her doors were allowed to fail and people were allowed to call someone. She looked relieved. I felt like a hypocrite with a tool belt. All day, I kept hearing Elara's last line in my workshop, the one about respecting her versus deciding for her. I had stopped the kiss because I did not want to take advantage of a woman still shaking loose from another man's story. That part was true. But another part of me had stopped because if I kissed her and she chose me anyway, I would have no safe excuse left for being wanted. Rafe texted around 5 asking if I could look at his back gate before the weekend. The latch had been sticking again, and his family was coming over for a small cookout. I stared at the message longer than a gate repair deserved. Going next door meant possibly seeing Elara. Not going meant making Rafe's fence a casualty of my emotional incompetence. I told him I would stop by. He sent back a thumbs up, then a second text saying Briar might be there, and he was already regretting every choice that led to this cookout. That should have warned me. It did warn me. I went anyway, because apparently I had decided the best way to avoid complicated feelings was to walk directly into a backyard containing all of them and a broken latch. Rafe's yard smelled like charcoal cut grass and family tension pretending to be hospitality. His aunt was arranging paper plates on a folding table. 2 cousins argued about cornhole rules like property law was involved. Rafe met me at the side gate with a beer he did not offer me, which told me he was still deciding whether I was a friend, a threat, or an unfortunately useful neighbor. Elara stood near the porch steps in a blue dress, holding a glass of lemonade with both hands. She looked composed, but I had learned that her composure often meant she had simply placed all the shaking somewhere private. Our eyes met for 1 second. It was enough to make my hand tighten around the tool bag. Then Briarvale stepped out of the kitchen behind her, polished, smiling, and unwelcome in a way only men like him could manage. Briar greeted me like we were both civilized props in the same unpleasant room. He said my name with just enough warmth to make it sound practiced, then glanced toward the gate and said it was good I could still be counted on. Rafe's jaw moved. Elara's face went still. I knelt by the latch because my hands needed something to do before they chose a worse option. For a few minutes, I let the metal give me cover. Briar spoke softly near the porch, but not softly enough. He told Rafe he was worried about Elara, that disappearing after a formal event and spending the night at a man's house was not like her. He made it sound like concern. He made everything sound like concern. Rafe said she was standing right there and could speak for herself. That surprised me enough that I looked up. Elara did too. Briar smiled, wounded and patient. He said, of course, but people under stress often mistook rebellion for clarity. Then he glanced toward me, still crouched by the gate, and added that running to a locksmith neighbor was certainly a choice. The yard went quiet in the slow way public discomfort spreads, one person at a time. Elara set her lemonade down on the porch rail. She told Briar not to dress insult up as worry. He tilted his head and said he was only pointing out that she had been vulnerable, and vulnerable people sometimes attached meaning to whoever happened to open the door. That was when I stood. Not quickly, not dramatically. Just stood, screwdriver still in my hand, and realized I was tired of being the quiet man in the background while other men explained what Elara's choices meant. I told Briar he was wrong. My voice came out calm enough that everyone heard it. Rafe looked at me sharply, but I kept my eyes on Briar because if I looked at Elara too soon, I might lose the courage to say the rest properly. I said Elara had knocked on my door, and I had opened it. I did not touch what was not offered. I did not ask for what she could not give. I did not turn her fear into romance, and I did not let her stand in the rain because protecting everyone's image mattered more than her being safe. Briar's smile thinned. I continued before he could polish another insult. I said if he found that embarrassing, maybe it was because he was used to rooms where Elara's dignity mattered less than the story people wanted to tell about her. Rafe stared at me like he was hearing two conversations at once, the one about his sister and the one about whether I had betrayed him. I turned to him then and said I should have answered his text faster that morning, and I was sorry for that. But I was not sorry she came to me, and I was not sorry I gave her a door that did not demand she perform pain correctly before entering. Rafe swallowed, and some of the anger left his face. Not all of it, but enough. Briar tried to laugh, saying this was becoming very noble for a man repairing a gate. I looked back at him and said the gate could wait. Then I looked at Elara, finally, and the whole yard seemed to narrow to her face. I told her she was never my emergency. She was the woman I wanted before the knock, before the rain, before the broken heel, before any of us had a socially acceptable explanation for why I kept looking for her at Rafe's cookouts. The words left me with no cover. No tools, no jokes, no decency I could hide behind. Elara's eyes filled, but she did not look away. Briar said her name once, warning or claim or both, and she did not turn toward him. That was answer enough. He left a few minutes later with the stiff politeness of a man who had lost control of a room and wanted everyone to pretend he had chosen the exit. Afterward, Rafe walked away to rescue burgers that had suffered from neglect, which was the closest thing to privacy the backyard could offer. Elara came to stand beside the half-fixed gate. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she asked, softly enough that only I could hear, if I had said all that because I meant it, or because I had finally gotten tired of watching other men close doors in her face. I did not answer Elara in Rafe's backyard, because the answer felt too important to leave beside a half-fixed gate with Briar's shadow still cooling on the grass. I wanted to say yes. I meant every word. I wanted to say I had meant it for months. Maybe from the first time she sat on Rafe's porch with a bucket of white roses between her knees and asked me if locks were honest. But the whole yard was still listening, in that pretending not to way families have. And Rafe was turning burgers with the emotional violence of a man who needed something harmless to burn. Elara deserved better than a confession that sounded like a reaction, so I told her I meant it, but I wanted to say it somewhere no one else could turn it into evidence. Her face tightened for 1 second, just enough to show me the fear underneath. Then she nodded, because Elara Quinn was brave enough to wait for the truth, even when waiting had hurt her before. That night, I drove to her florist studio with the repaired heel on the passenger seat. It looked ridiculous there, one elegant shoe resting beside a ring of keys, a flashlight, and a receipt for brass screws. But I brought it anyway because it was the first thing she had left behind in my house, and I had finally understood that returning it was not about giving her a shoe. It was about showing her I had paid attention to what broke without deciding she was broken. The studio lights were still on when I arrived. Through the front window, I saw Elara standing at a long work table, taking apart leftover wedding arrangements. White flowers, green stems, ribbon, torn tape, all the beautiful remains of someone else's perfect day. She looked tired, but not defeated. Her hair was pinned up loosely, and there were petals stuck to her sleeve. For a moment, I stood outside like a fool, a locksmith hesitating in front of an unlocked door. She looked up before I knocked. Maybe she saw my reflection. Maybe she felt me standing there the way I had felt her at every cookout and driveway conversation. She came to the door and opened it without smiling too quickly. I respected that too. Elara had spent too long making other people comfortable. I did not want another polished version of her. I wanted the woman who could stand in a room full of dying flowers and still make it feel alive. I held up the heel and told her I had brought back the evidence. She glanced at it, then at me, and said, "Evidence of what?" I stepped inside, the studio smelling of roses, wet stems, and cold coffee, and said evidence that I had been paying attention since before I had the courage to admit it. She did not move closer, but she did not move away. That was enough. I set the heel gently on the work table beside a pile of ribbon. Then I told her I had meant what I said in Rafe's yard. I wanted her before the midnight knock, before Briar's speech, before the rain put her on my porch with that broken shoe in her hand. I wanted her during every too-short conversation that ended because Rafe came outside, or because she had flowers to deliver, or because I suddenly remembered I was supposed to be a decent man with boundaries. I wanted her when she laughed at my bad jokes, when she looked exhausted from making other people's weddings beautiful, when she watched me fix a gate like steadiness was not something to apologize for. My voice was not smooth. Good. Smooth would have sounded too much like Briar. Elara's eyes shone, but she kept them on me. She asked why I stopped the kiss in my workshop. There were a dozen noble answers, and only one whole one. I told her I stopped because I was afraid of becoming another man who decided what her feelings meant. I told her I had dressed that fear up as respect, and some of it had been respect, but some of it had been cowardice. I had been afraid that if she chose me clearly, without crisis, without rain, without Briar in the background, then I would have to believe I was more than useful. I would have to believe safe could be wanted. Elara looked down then, her fingers brushing the ribbon on the table. She said she did not need me to rescue her from Briar, Rafe, her family, or herself. She needed me to open the door and trust that she knew why she was walking through it. I crossed the last few feet slowly, giving her every chance to step back. She did not. I told her I could do that. Then I corrected myself, because love deserved better than another man promising competence. I told her I wanted to learn how to do that with her, to ask instead of assume, to protect without managing, to be safe without turning safety into a locked room. Elara let out a breath that seemed to loosen something she had been holding for years. Then she smiled, just barely, and said that was better than the backyard speech. I told her I had better lighting this time. She laughed, and the laugh broke the last hard edge in the room. I asked if I could kiss her. Not because I was uncertain, but because asking felt like the first honest door between us. Elara stepped close enough that the front of her sweater brushed my jacket and said yes. The kiss was not dramatic. It did not try to erase Briar, Rafe, the rain, or the months of restraint. It simply gathered all of it and made room for something clearer. Her hand came to my chest. My hand settled at her waist, and for once I did not feel like the man someone called when something failed. I felt chosen while everything was still standing. When we pulled apart, Elara touched her forehead to mine and whispered that she knew exactly where she was. I told her I was glad, because I was done pretending I did not want her there. Months later, Rafe still gave me looks sometimes, but they had softened from threat assessment to brotherly annoyance. June started calling me the man with emotional deadbolts, which I accepted because she was usually holding pruning shears when she said it. Briar became a name Elara could hear without folding inward. The repaired heel stayed on a shelf in her studio, not as proof that I had fixed her, but as proof that one broken night had not been the end of her story. Elara came to my house after late installations, and sometimes I went to the studio with takeout, sitting at the work table while she stripped thorns from roses and told me which brides were secretly disasters. We went slow, but not because we were hiding. Slow became a way to choose each other carefully in daylight, not just desperately after midnight. The last time she knocked after midnight, I was not surprised. I opened the door and found her on my porch in jeans, tired from a wedding installation, holding leftover flowers and smiling before I could ask if she was okay. She said she knew it was late, and I told her my door had learned her schedule. Then she stepped closer, kissed me once, and said she did not come because she had nowhere else to go. She came because she knew exactly where she wanted to be. I opened the door wider, and this time, when Elara walked inside, there was no crisis behind her, only choice. Do you think being someone's safe place can be romantic, or does real love need more than safety? And have you ever chosen a door not because you had nowhere else to go, but because it finally felt like where you belonged? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. If this story stayed with you, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.